So this is lecture 2 in the series Hermeneutics. We talked in the first lecture, we talked about the hermeneutical considerations. Now we are going to look at what we call the grammatical historical method. And again, we are touching on something very important. And when I say important, I mean the reason for it came into being was very special. But when you look back, you will find for yourself that this is not something that is being invented by what we call the reformers. I'm not sure that something like that exists in Sri Lanka, but in the United States there is a supreme board of what we call hermeneutics. They are called the Supreme Court of the United States. And what do they do is the following. In the States you have what is called the original Constitution. But the original Constitution is written 200 years ago, and with wording of 200 years ago. And so you have this board, what we can call the Supreme Board of Hermeneutics in the United States. They are guarding the original meaning of that specific document called the Constitution of the United States. So this is important. You have a group of people who are doing, you can almost say, doing nothing else. Well, that's of course not true. They are doing many more things than just guarding it. But they will write articles, they will talk about it, they will have meetings on it. And if someone is coming up with a certain idea, it has to go through that board, and the board has to talk about it. They have to meet and so on. And that's only about a written document written by the founding fathers of the United States. I wish we would have something like that. But there's nothing comparable to it today. When Martin Luther in the 16th century, when he was rebelling against the Roman Catholic Church, there were specific reasons for it. One of the things was that he was rebelling because the church put no emphasis at all in the personal experience of the individual believers. Or yes, they had what we call the priesthood and the monks and so on. Actually, not just only those, but there are a whole range of people who were personally working on their salvation. Luther was not against thinking about salvation and doing things when you were saved, but he was also he had a problem with the explanation of the church of the biblical text. The Roman Catholic Church used what they call at that time the quadriga. Quadriga is a word, and it speaks about quad, which is 4. So he had 4 levels of interpretation. We are going to visit revisit that word again later on, so I'm not going to go into it, but just take that on board. There were 4 different layers of explanation. So if you could, you take a text and you go to 4 different parish churches, and you will get 4 different explanations, because there was not one explanation that was more important than the other. So Luther said, no, we can't do that. I mean, look at the history of when the people were writing the materials which we call the Bible now. Remember, Luther himself was a Bible translator, so he had to go over and say, what is the real meaning in the original language? I mean, he was not alone. I mean, he was with other people, and other people helped him. When he had a problem with the Greek or with the Hebrew, he went to his friends and said, can you help me out here? Because I need to understand the word. But not only the word, it's also the sentence, and it's also the history of when it was written, where it was written. And so he came up with the idea, you have to link it to the history of the text itself. That was already totally different from the quadriga, and it was a revolution in theology. And then he came up with the idea, it's not only the history that's important, but it's also the grammar. What words are used where? So he brought those 2 together, and so that's why we have this grammatical historical method, or grammatical historical hermeneutic, or the grammatico historical method. Okay, it's just different wordings or different names actually for the same idea. There is a link between the grammar of a text, the history of that text, where, when it was written, why it was written, how come it was written and it's now in our Bibles, things like that. That's what he thought was very was very important, and it still is. And then he was trying to understand what the text really was saying, not just using other translations of the Bible, because there were very limited number of translations. When he translated the Bible in German, there was no full Bible translation in the German language. So he had to go to other languages, to Dutch and to French and to English, but none of them had their own full translation of the Bible. So they were actually working at different places at the same time, and he was sitting at the Wartburg, which is a place somewhere in Germany. He was locked up and he was working on that Bible translation. Eventually, he would lead what is called the Reformation, because he brought ideas that the people never heard. I mean, in that time, that was totally different for them. And so he brought those ideas to the people. He was a professor at the university, and you can still visit that university because it's still in existence today. We went there and we saw the buildings of the university. Like I said, it's still there. When Luther was teaching there, he was building up a problem, because his teaching was different from what the Catholic Church was teaching. But since he was a professor at the university. He had kind of status, and the people accepted for a time. They accepted it, but then the word spread, and some people were not that happy with what he was saying or trying to convey. He himself went through a what we call conversion experience when he understood a text from the book of Romans 1 verse 16. Suddenly he dawned to him what it means, and he started preaching from that in the local church, and he was teaching at the university. And then there was a problem, and he was summoned to a place, and he was kidnapped. And the kidnapping was actually set in scene to make sure that he was not being killed by other people. But that's history. But he came up with what is called the grammatical historical hermeneutics. At that time they called it new, until they found out that it was not new at all, because the earliest church fathers were using actually that same system of hermeneutics. What they were trying to do, and what Luther was trying to do, what we are still trying to do, is taking a Bible passage, and it has one basic meaning, which was firmly rooted in the historical truth and related accurately according to the common principles of human language. Thus it was historical, but it was interconnected, because we are not talking about one time in history, we are talking about a long time in different, you can almost say, in different histories, in different parts of history. And so then they applied the idea of the grammatical, and we see that was very strong. Because before they were talking about the spiritual meaning and the symbolic meaning and the non-literal meaning, but now we had people saying, okay, let's look at what is the meaning, the original meaning of the Greek word or the Hebrew word or the Aramaic word being used in the manuscripts we have. And so suddenly you had a breakout of people looking at what we call the etymological meaning of the words. And even today, we have to go back to the etymological, that is the original meaning of a word. That can be a noun, that can be a verb. It doesn't matter. It is something we have to keep in mind. That is what is important, to see what is the author saying about it. Okay, some words were in use for several hundred years before the author used it. So is the author using it in the original etymological meaning, or is he giving you can almost say, a new etymological meaning for the text or for the word? So that's what we have to look for. Then we can compare it with other texts from outside of the Bible, see whether that specific words is being used in a different way, in a different setting, and so on. And that's another thing we have to look for. But so we have this purely grammatical, historical hermeneutics by Luther. And he found out that the early church was using that, and we will see what happened later on. Okay, so let's look at the biblical interpretation. And here we go for a kind of a difficult thing, because a very well-known person in our Bibles, a man with the name of Ezra, which was one of the rebuilders of Jerusalem, the city and the temple. He gathered around a number of people who were interested in knowing more about the Bible, knowing more about the manuscripts that were in existence in the temple at that time. Some were hidden while the people were in exile, and so they were digging up the materials and bringing it back to the temple, so they had to rebuild the temple and so on. And so you had a number of people who were interested in what you would today call Bible study, or getting to know the Bible a bit more. In other words, we can call it theology. But what did they do? They were looking at the observance of the law. But what they were doing was they were reinterpreting what the law said. So eventually they came up with ideas that were completely alien to the law itself, but they were the people, the smart people. And you know the name, because in the New Testament you find them also. This is called the scribes. And the scribes, they had a certain power over the text. When there was a problem, they were the ones who could explain it. They were the living concordances. The problem was they themselves had the wrong idea. And instead of devoting themselves to the study and to the study of the scriptures and the law, they were actually devoting themselves to their interpretation, the reinterpretation of the law. We call that exposition. Exposition itself is positive, but when you do it wrong, you have a wrong thing that comes out. So the setting, exposition means the setting forth of facts, ideas, etc. It's a detailed explanation of writings or speaking, and give the explanation about it. Exposition is not, you have to understand, exposition is not the same as description. It's not the same as narrative or narration. It's not the same as argumentation. Okay? Exposition is something different. Ezra's scribes developed a systematic way of reducing the law to a, you can almost say, to a certain number of what is called, what we would call formula. Yeah, that was both legalistic, but also, somebody wrote it this way, fanciful. It means imaginary. It was not linked anymore to the real meaning of the text itself. It was now, lifted out of the real literal meaning. So the scribes' system of interpretation made it impossible. The scribes made it impossible with their interpretation to interpret the Old Testament. By the time of Jesus, the Jewish understanding of the scriptures had been clouded with a faulty system of hermeneutics. And it was led by the scribes. Then you get a reaction. And the reaction comes from a group of people. Actually, we will look at 4 or 5 of them, but yeah, they are reacting to this type. So inside the Jewish religion, you had a group called the Jewish literalists. They were going for the literal meaning, but yeah, not the literal meaning as we know it. And one of the leaders, one of the first and most important leaders, was the person with the name Hillel. Hillel was the grandfather of Gamaliel, and Gamaliel was therefore the grandson of Hillel, but Gamaliel also was the teacher of Paul. So Hillel, he was born in Babylon. He came to Jerusalem for training, and in Jerusalem he founded what is called the Talmudic system. That is, you have to explain the Talmud. The Talmud is the explanation of the wise men, the sages of the Jewish people, and even today you will have the Talmud, and it goes back to hundreds of years, to sages living anywhere. I mean, not just in Israel, but in different places. And those sages wrote down materials, and they are kind of revered because of what they wrote down. And so Hillel was one of them, was actually the first one. He brought those things together. And he had 7 laws or 7 layers of interpretation, which in itself is okay, because then you at least know what and how they go and how they work, what the function of hermeneutics for them was. The first rule, the first law was the heavy and light. So you have light and heavy, or the lesser and the greater thing. So, and that was built on the idea of Numbers 12 verse 4. Hillel used that as an example. So number 2 is the relation between 2 subjects from an identical expression. Let me explain this. There was a daily sacrifice in the temple. That meant that a daily sacrifice means daily. That's also on the Sabbath. But that also meant on holidays. For example, Passover. So you had to have a Passover daily sacrifice. Of course, it was not daily Passover, but it was daily sacrifice, and also done on the Passover. Just think about it. Because in the New Testament we have a very specific example of what is going on. Number 3, the extension from the special to the general. Okay, you have a limited, it goes open to the general. That's kind of a funnel in the other way. Then number 4 is the explanation of 2 passages by a 3rd passage. In some cases, of course, you have certain things that are being repeated or being talked about and being re-talked about and being again brought up. For example, one of the things we find is the circumcision in the early church. It comes up and up and up, and you know, there's even a big problem, and they have to find a solution for that problem. But in the Old Testament, and that's what we're talking about, when Hillel was there, you know, he had that that wonderful idea of when there are two passages saying something and it's not clear, that maybe a third one will explain it. Number 5, guidance from a general situation was applied to a special situation. So we had from special to general, and now we have from general to special. The funnel in the right way. Number 6, the explanation of a passage from an analogy of another passage. Very simple. You have a passage which is difficult, but you find another passage speaking about the same thing and explains it. So you bring those two together. That's a good thing. Many of the things that Hillel had was good. You know? Number 7, an application from passages that were self-evident. How can you say that? It's something that's so simple, self-evident. It's so simple. Why do you look further? I mean, it's explained in the text itself. So those are the 7 rules or laws of Hillel. These rules allowed the scribes that came after Hillel to make a multitude of false interpretations. Of course, there was also a multitude of right interpretations, but we don't have a problem with that. We have a problem when they make the wrong interpretations. And so the second person in the series of 5 is Shammai. Shammai was kind of the antipole of Hillel. He was in the same time, he was the rival, and he was an extreme formalist. Strangely enough, very extreme. For example, around the day of the Day of Atonement, around the Day of Atonement, you have a fast. That's fine. Except when you have a newborn baby and you let that baby fast because of the Day of Atonement coming. You see, but that was his doing. His daughter was delivering a baby, and she was in labor just around the time of the Feast of the Tabernacles. And what do they do? What do the Jews do when they have the Feast of the Tabernacles? Well, they set up a tent-like structure in the house or outside the house. So what he did, Shammai, he built a tent or a tabernacle over the bed of his daughter who was delivering a baby. I mean, speaking about extreme literalism, it's absolute legalism. It's there and we have to do it. No way we can deal with it. So that was you can almost say the opposite of Hillel, but actually it's going deeper and deeper into a problem. So number 3 of the people is Gamaliel himself. Like I said, he's the grandson of Hillel, and it was the teacher of Paul. Is probably one of the best known Pharisees we know of, except for Paul. He had a wider scope. He was more broad-minded than most of his contemporary. And you can see that when you read in the Gospels and in the book of Acts, when he interferes in the Sanhedrin, when he comes up for the early church, he's the one who says, okay, don't persecute those people. When what they are believing is a thing of God, it will survive. If it's not from God, it will fade away. And he was right. And it not only survived, but it went bigger and bigger. And then he said, you know, we cannot fight against God. So he had a broader scope, broad mind. He was also someone who taught and learned Greek literature, which was very special because they themselves were not Greek speaking, although the large number of people in the Jewish community were Greek speaking. I mean, they had as first language Greek. And so he was actually helping them. He was speaking about the literature in their own language. And so you have this linkage between the two. And that's the one who taught Paul. Remember that. He advocates the privileges or the rights of the Gentiles. Remember, the Old Testament said that the Jewish people have to take care of the non-Jewish people who live in their cities, between the walls, or inside the walls, inside the gates. That's the way they would explain that. When a non-Jew lives there, you still have to consider him not as a brother, but you have to consider him as a human being and treat him as such. Many of the other Jews say, well, no, the Jews are the better ones. The Gentiles are the Gentiles. But Gamaliel was different. And then you had two more people. First one was Ishmael, and of course you automatically think of Ishmael with Abraham, but that's nothing to do with it because he lived in 150 AD, which was 150 after Christ. And then he had no less than 13 rules of interpretation. And then the next one lives in the same time era, and his name is Eliezer ben Jose, and he came up with 32 rules of interpretation. Like I said, there's nothing wrong with having rules. It's a bit of a difficulty if you split out and you separate all the different things. Okay, so you have first, remember the scribes we were talking about? The scribes with Ezra, and then you had the Jewish literalism, and then as a reaction to Jewish literalism, you have what is called the Jewish allegorism. And we will come back to allegorism because it happens in the early church also. An allegory is a story which people and things and happenings have another meaning than the context of the story or the fable or the parable. So it's a type of forced interpretation. And Alexandria was very strong on it. Alexandria in Egypt, in Africa. It was the center of what is called Jewish allegoric interpretation. One person who was there was the leader, and his name was Aristobulus. Aristobulus is, we're not completely sure, but maybe at least one of the earliest, if he's not the earliest, allegoric teacher. He taught that the Greek philosophers and poets derived their ideas from the Greek translation of the Old Testament. In itself, that may be completely true. Of course, it's difficult to say exactly. Did those philosophers use the material of the Old Testament? Or what some people say, just the opposite. It's the Old Testament using the philosophers. Well, I think that the philosophers came later than the Greek translations of the Old Testament. So I assume that we can say that at least some of the philosophers were influenced by Old Testament materials. And they had a type of allegoric explanation. So Philo, some call them Philo, but I think it's Philo, made a major contribution in harmonizing the institutions and ideas of Judaism into Greek philosophy and Greek culture. He thought that that scripture contained a twofold meaning. One level, another level. The literal meaning and the allegoric level, or the allegoric meaning. They were like body and soul. And Philo used Psalm 62 verse 11 as a text verse to defend the type of interpretation he had. Because it says in that specific verse, it says, one thing God has spoken, two things have I heard. So, yeah, well, with a little bit of twisting in the text, you can have the difference between allegoric and literal meaning, or the difference between body and soul, but that's another thing. And then it goes, since soul is more important than the body, the allegoric meaning is more important than the literal meaning. And there you have the wrong thing. Because it's just the opposite. Let me give you an example of how they thought the allegoric meaning, they poured in the allegoric meaning into the Bible text. In Genesis 2 verse 10, we find four rivers being mentioned: the Pishon, the Gihon, the Tigris, and the Euphrates. According to allegoric meaning, they were symbols of the four virtues: prudence, temperance, courage, and justice. Where did they get it? I have no clue. I really don't know. I really don't know. You see? That's typical of an allegoric meaning. There's no specific basis. You cannot say because this or that, or because one color of the river was green, and that goes together with temperance or courage, and the other one was blue and it goes together with justice or something, or white. See, no, there's no explanation, and it's not in the text or even in the name. It's not implied. Okay, so we have the allegorism here. Let's now look, and we have to actually go back. Let's look at Jesus. How did Jesus interpret the Old Testament? Well, first of all, he never critiqued any of the texts. You cannot find a critique to the text itself. What you find is critique to the application of the scribes, Sadducees, Pharisees, or the common people. We have to remember that Jesus was not a rabbi, in the sense that, yeah, he was a teacher, but he was not a rabbi trained in a rabbinical school. But he knew the difficulties, and he knew the ways around things, and he knew how those people from the rabbinical schools were misusing, misquoting the biblical material. And I think that Jesus did not want to be identified with one of the rabbinical schools. That's why he probably never went to a rabbinical school. Jesus often described the scribes and the interpreters of the law, which were in some cases the Sadducees, in some cases the Pharisees. He says, ever hearing, never understanding, ever seeing, never perceiving. Matthew 13, verse 14. Jesus quoted David in Matthew 12, verse 36. But he says, the Holy Spirit says. So it was the Holy Spirit through David speaking. And then you have, and I think that's a very powerful statement of Jesus. He spoke about Adam, Eve, Noah, Abraham, David, Solomon, Jonah, Isaiah. And he spoke about them as literal people, part of history. And I think that is important for us to see that exactly that makes him part of what we call the grammatic historical interpretation. When Jesus was talking about the Old Testament, many times he used the spiritual values. He could see God's purpose in the scriptures for the human race. That was something not completely new, but it was special. There were 36 direct quotes by Jesus of the Old Testament. And in many times he used the terminology of the Old Testament, even in his speech. Of course, that was linking to the audience. When Jesus was quoting the Old Testament, he was actually reinforcing his own teaching. Jesus appealed to no higher authority when he taught. He was the source of his teaching. He was the source of his teaching. And remember, that's a reaction of the people. He taught with authority. Not as the teachers, but he taught with authority. People could hear, could feel him. Jesus' interpretation method was completely new as he explained the meaning of the Old Testament. People could not follow because they were so brainwashed by the scribes. And so his interpretation was at that time totally new. Jesus did not give a new intellectual approach, such as a literal or an allegoric, but instead was coming of God into the world to explain the written word of God. So he's talking about himself. A chance occurred with the coming of Christ, because the question was not the true meaning of the text, but the relationship of the text with Jesus and his purpose. And that's number 14, he interpreted to them all the scriptures and the things concerning himself. You can find it in Luke 24 verse 27. So you see, Jesus fit in the grammatical, historical, but it has a special layer. The spiritual part, and the fact that he was talking about himself even when he talked about the Old Testament. In our next lecture, we will go to the apostles and look at their interpretation